Hi, everyone. This is Vijay Limaye. I'm a scientist working on climate change and health with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are a nonprofit environmental advocacy group, and I work closely with our India team, including Palash Mukherjee, who is there in attendance with you at the South Asia Heat Health Summit. I'm sorry to miss your gathering, but very grateful for the invitation to share some of our work on estimating the health costs of extreme heat exposures. So I want to begin this presentation by talking a little bit about the background and the need for economic valuation of the health effects associated with extreme heat exposures. We have seen headlines more and more in recent days, including this one that appeared just last month, demonstrating the huge economic risks posed by climate change for countries around the world. We know that climate change is expected to damage property, crops, and infrastructure, but also adversely affect human health. And so more and more we're seeing national and international assessments call attention to the gigantic economic risks associated with climate change. Unfortunately, many of those assessments leave out the human story of impacts, including from extreme heat exposures. Because we know that the health impacts of climate sensitive events are excluded from these huge assessments, we were really motivated to understand just how much does an exposure like extreme heat cost to our health. And here we're talking about health impacts in terms of their direct form, whether it's a death or an illness triggered by extreme heat, but also the pocketbook economic ramifications of those health problems in terms of the cost of treating illness that's caused by extreme heat exposures. That question motivated our overall study approach. So I want to call attention to our new research published just a few months ago in the journal GeoHealth, which explored the health costs of climate-sensitive events across the United States. We applied a case study approach that used recent US events of climate-related health harms in a single year to quantify at the state level how much the economic burden of the health problems were in each state. We applied what we called a combined valuation method that accounts for the economic impacts of the cost of illness, including lost wages while folks were dealing with medical treatment, but also the economic ramifications of deaths associated with climate-sensitive exposures. The full reference for this paper is on the slide, and I'm happy to send it to any of you after this talk. So this map gives you a sense of each of the case studies that we looked at across the United States for a single year, 2012. We looked across 10 different types of case studies spanning 11 US states, exploring the health consequences and costs of climate-sensitive events. So each of the environmental exposures depicted on this map is expected to worsen in one way or another due to climate change into the future. We took advantage of available health data at the local level to tell the story of human health problems and costs associated with each of the exposures. For the extreme heat case study, we focused on the state in yellow, Wisconsin, where I grew up, and drew on the available data collected at the state health department level on illness and death triggered by extreme heat exposures. So we looked at the range of illnesses associated with extreme heat that sent folks to the hospital during the summer of 2012, including exposure to excessive heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat fatigue, heat stroke, and mortality. Once we had collected the available health data, the next step in our method was to connect the health incidence data to health cost data. We relied on federal government databases of healthcare costs across the country to estimate the health costs associated with the exposures in each of our case studies. So we looked across this range of impacts, these 6 laid out on this slide, to connect the health problem to the health costs. For deaths, we relied on the value of a statistical life metric that's widely applied in federal rulemaking to understand the economic ramifications of premature mortality. For the other impacts depicted here, medical care, lost wages, outpatient care, home health care needs, and prescribed medications, we relied on another U.S. federal government database that tracks consumer spending for medical care across the country in each year. We wanted to depict the whole array of health costs associated with each of these case studies and understand what costs were hitting families even after folks were discharged from a hospital. So I will move on to our key results. This slide depicts the health problems that we identified in each of our climate-sensitive case studies, and the case study for extreme heat is highlighted in red text. Overall, we estimated that in the extreme heat case study, there were 27 deaths caused by extreme heat exposure, 155 hospital admissions, and more than 1,600 emergency room visits. Across our whole case study set, we estimated more than 900 deaths, 20,000 hospital admissions, and almost 18,000 emergency room visits. You can see here that the range of health impacts varied by case study. We wanted to use each local level case study to start to tell the story of what was happening nationally with the heat exposure. We know that extreme heat was certainly afflicting states beyond Wisconsin, but we had the best available data for that single state. So given those huge impacts in terms of human health problems associated with each case study, our next results depict the health costs associated with each event. Again, the extreme heat case study results are highlighted in red text here. Here you can see that the cost of those deaths in Wisconsin added up to about $246 million US. The cost of illness topped $5 million, and the total health costs were about $252 million for a single year. The results on this slide align with other studies in identifying huge costs associated with premature deaths, but significant costs of illness. And I'll note here that in many studies, the cost of illness is underestimated or completely disregarded just due to the lack of available data. So overall, we estimated many millions of dollars imposed in health costs in a single state due to the health problems triggered by extreme heat exposures. This slide presents some thoughts on the needs for data to assemble such a health cost estimate, and there's 4 key steps. First, there's a need to characterize heat exposures, whether they are present day or into the future, and really draw on the established scientific evidence in terms of the relationship between temperature and expectations of premature mortality and morbidity. The next step in the process is to come up with those health outcome numbers, whether it's relying on the available data collected within health systems or through modeling, to understand the full scope of heat health impacts in terms of premature deaths and illnesses associated with these exposures. The next step is to connect health impacts to costs. And here we really need information on a number of impacts. The costs of lost lives, commonly deployed using the value of a statistical life, the cost of direct care in a hospital, whether it's in an emergency room or someone who requires hospitalization for care, the wages that are lost at work while people are treating their medical issues in a hospital, as well as the ongoing care needs in terms of outpatient care and prescribed medications to deal with the health problems triggered by exposure to extreme heat. So it's steps 1, 2, and 3, when you combine those, that you really are able to assemble an estimate of the health costs associated with extreme heat exposures. So given that broad framework, I do want to note a number of challenges that remain in estimating health costs. First, in many places, there's a lack of access to basic surveillance data, especially for morbidity triggered by extreme heat exposures and other exposures related to climate change. Furthermore, this data is often not available at a consistent scale that's easily applicable within health cost studies. Second, I want to note that this was not a causal attribution study of climate change to health costs. Rather, we applied a case study approach in order to draw attention to the present-day burden of extreme heat exposures and the present-day costs. The big challenge here is using those case studies and making the connection to potentially hundreds of future events in terms of extreme heat exposures that are expected due to climate change. We lack the capacity to stitch together these case studies nationally in the United States and certainly elsewhere, but ideally we would get to a place where we can identify the total health costs for a country associated with the health harms of climate change. With that, I will wrap up my remarks, but leave my contact information on this slide. My NRDC colleague Palash Mukherjee is in attendance and can help collect your questions that I'll respond to after the summit. Congratulations on your meeting, and once again, thank you for the invitation.